The veil was wrong. That was the first thing Lady Sophronia Aldgate said when she saw it. Not wrong in the way of a veil that had slipped its pins, not wrong in the way of old lace gone yellow at the edges, but wrong in the specific, pleasurable way of a thing whose wrongness confirmed something one had long suspected. Sophronia raised her lorgnette and set it to the small, satisfied cluster at her elbow, with the conviction of a woman who has been pronouncing verdicts for 40 years and has never yet been asked to account for one. The veil is wrong. 3 rows ahead in the nave, Mrs. Constance Vane, widow, lately of Dorset, without a single voucher to her name in all of London, stood and pretended not to hear. She was very good at that. She had learned the particular discipline of not hearing in Dorset, when the village had first begun to forget that her husband had been a man worth knowing, when the calls had grown shorter and then ceased, and the invitations had simply stopped arriving, as invitations will when there is no longer anyone in the house with the social currency to justify the postage. She had learned it again on the mail coach north, when the woman across from her had looked at her plain mourning veil, and then looked at her gloved hands, and then looked away with the slow certainty of someone who has calculated another person's worth to the last farthing and found nothing worth the courtesy of discretion. She was still learning it here, in this chrysanthemum-heavy nave, at the autumn wedding of a cousin she barely knew, surrounded by people who had arrived in their own carriages and whose morning callers had left cards on silver trays. The veil had belonged to her mother. The stitching at the border was her mother's own hand, worked in the long evenings of a marriage that had been brief and entirely without funds, in the small house in Suffolk, where the gardens had been the only luxury they could still afford to maintain. Her mother had worn it to her father's funeral and folded it after into the cedar chest with the letters and the one piece of jewelry she had not sold. Constance had found the chest 3 months ago, when she had gone looking for something appropriate to wear to her husband's burial, and she had taken the veil out and held it in the gray afternoon light and put it on because she had nothing else, and because the silk had smelled, very faintly, of her mother's rose water. She had not thought to examine the stitching closely. It was grief. One does not examine things closely in grief. One simply endures. The church filled in the way of wedding churches, the particular rustling, self-arranging pressure of people sorting themselves by rank without being told, finding their pews with the infallible social instinct that never requires a seating plan when the distinctions are sufficiently clear. Constance was sorted, without anyone touching her, to a row near the back, near a pillar, near the kind of strategic obscurity that persons of reduced circumstance learn to inhabit with something that looks, from a distance, very much like dignity. She settled her gloved hands in her lap and watched the candlelight on the gilded altar rail and counted the chrysanthemums in the nearest arrangement and read the inscription on the nearest memorial stone, because it was something to do with her eyes that was not watching the assembled quality observe her. The memorial stone concerned a man named Philip, who had died in 1783 and had been, according to the inscription, greatly beloved. She wondered who had chosen the word greatly, and whether they had meant it. She was still considering Philip when the church went quiet in a different way, not the expectant, rustling quiet of a ceremony about to begin, but the particular quiet that one man can produce by crossing a threshold, a stillness borrowed from his presence. She had noticed the phenomenon before, in Dorset, when a man of consequence arrived at a gathering and the room reorganized around him as unconsciously as water reorganizes around a stone. She heard the step. She heard the soft reshuffling of bodies in the rows behind her. She heard Lady Sophronia release a long breath that was not precisely a sigh and not precisely anything else. And then she heard nothing at all, because she was very deliberately not looking. "Pardon me." The voice was low, level. The kind of voice that has learned through long practice to produce exactly the volume required and no more. The voice of a man who has been in rooms where his word carries consequence and has learned to use that economy as its own form of authority. Constance looked up. The man standing at the end of her row was perhaps 35. She could not have said precisely, because his face was the sort that does not age in the ordinary way, not preserved in youth, but set, the way granite is set after the weather has finished with it, the way a country road becomes its final self after enough seasons of frost and thaw. He wore a dark coat and a cravat of so precise a white that it seemed almost to generate its own light against the dim nave's gold. His expression conveyed nothing whatsoever, and yet conveyed it with such complete intention that the nothing became, itself, informative. He was looking at her seat. She was in his seat. This comprehension arrived in full about 3 seconds before she could make herself act on it. "I am sorry," she said, and rose, and stepped aside, and in stepping aside made the small error of stepping into the aisle at exactly the moment he moved to let her pass, so that she was suddenly standing directly in front of him, with the pillar behind her and the pew at her back, and no exit that did not require one of them to move first. His eyes were gray, not the uncertain gray of an overcast sky, but a deliberate gray, the gray of a winter river that has decided on its color and kept it. He looked at the veil first, then at her face, then at the border of the veil again, for precisely 1 beat longer than strict social protocol required. "There is room," he said. He gestured at the pew with one gloved hand, a gesture calibrated to invitation, without quite being one. "If you would remain." She should have said no. Her mouth said nothing, which her body took as instruction. And she sat. And he sat beside her. And the church recovered its composure and proceeded toward a wedding. Behind them, at some remove, Sophronia Aldgate's lorgnette made a small, precise, percussive click. If you have ever sat beside a person who does not look at you and still manages to occupy every inch of your awareness, then you understand what the next hour was for Constance. He did not speak. He did not lean. He kept his gloved hands folded on the prayer book in his lap, with the disciplined stillness of a man who has learned to inhabit public spaces without giving them anything to use against him. He stood when the congregation stood, and sat when it sat, and looked at the altar, with the serious attention of a man who may or may not have been thinking about the ceremony. And yet she knew, with the body's embarrassing and involuntary precision, exactly how far his shoulder was from hers, exactly when his breathing shifted, exactly the 2 moments when his gaze moved, as it did twice during the long middle sections of the service, to the edge of her veil. She watched the bride. She watched the candles. She told herself she was watching the ceremony. If you are wondering, as I suspect you are, what he saw that others had dismissed, stay with her a little longer. The answer is coming, and it is worth the wait. Constance had met the assembled company of the wedding at the church door, where her cousin's new mother-in-law had looked at her veil and said very gently, "How brave of you to come so soon after." The sentence was impeccably composed. It meant that your mourning is not quite right. Your presence is an imposition, and we are grateful for the bravery it requires on our part to overlook both, and we hope you feel the gratitude appropriately. She had met the Fuller company at the wedding breakfast that followed, arranged in the long dining room of the house in Mayfair that smelled of roses and beeswax, and the specific species of confidence that comes from having had money for more than 1 generation. The tablecloth was better than anything Constance had touched in 3 years. She noticed this the way she noticed things now, carefully, without allowing the noticing to show. Miss Aurelia Fitch was standing with two other women near the fireplace when Constance entered the room, and Miss Fitch said to the woman at her left, in the carrying voice of someone accustomed to being heard, "Is that the Dorset widow? She looks exactly as one imagined. Plain veil, plain face, plain purse, the complete set." The woman at her left laughed the brief, approving laugh of someone receiving currency. Miss Fitch was the loveliest woman in the room by general assent. Rose satin, dark hair dressed high, diamonds at her throat that caught the candle glow and held it. She was, Constance gathered from the rapid intelligence of her cousin's maid of honor, the most likely match for the man Constance had sat beside in the church. His name was Edmund Carew, Earl of Stanholt. He had a seat in Wiltshire, an income of $8,000 a year, a ward of 11 named George, who had recently been asked to leave a school near Bath under circumstances that had not been entirely explained, and a reputation for coldness that mothers of daughters found both alarming and magnetic, in the way of things that might be transformed. Constance filed all of this in the compartment of her mind reserved for information pertaining to other people's lives, because that was where it belonged. She did not notice Lord Stanholt observing her from across the room until she turned and found him already not observing, his eyes on the window, his expression unchanged, the distance between them half a dining room and entirely uncrossable. She told herself it was the veil. He had recognized something on the veil, perhaps, some detail of craftsmanship, some irregularity that caught the eye the way certain things catch the eye in a room full of ordinary objects. She told herself this because it was the explanation that required the least of her, the explanation that kept the largest distance between what had happened and any meaning she might accidentally attach to it. The table was long, and the seating was arranged with the hostess's particular mathematics, and Constance found herself between an elderly general who was somewhat deaf and a young clergyman on his first social engagement of any consequence, who ate his food with the earnest determination of a man doing a duty. She spoke to both with genuine care. The general had served at the same campaign as her father in a year before Constance was born, and he told her things about her father that she had not known, the quality of his courage in a specific situation, a joke he had made that the general had kept for 30 years. She had to manage her expression carefully during this part of the conversation. The toasts were made. The wine went round. The afternoon lengthened, and she thought about leaving, about the small calculation of departures. When was early enough to be unobtrusive and late enough not to appear ungrateful? She became aware that Lord Stanholt had left the table in the way one becomes aware of a sound that has been present and has now stopped. The small boy appeared shortly after, from a direction that had not been officially assigned to him. He was 11, or perhaps 12, with his coat pressed but one boot carrying a crescent of dried mud near the toe, and he was holding in both cupped hands a small brown bird that had, from its stillness, recently collided with something glass. "Is it dead?" Constance asked. The boy assessed her with the frank evaluation of a child who has learned that adults ask questions they do not actually want the true answer to. He was Edmund Carew's ward. She had deduced this from the profile, the same set of the jaw, the same quality of stillness that in the boy read as watchfulness rather than restraint. "Not yet," he said. "It flew into the window outside. I saw it from the garden." "What were you doing in the garden?" A pause. "Observing things." "May I?" She held out her gloved hands. He considered her for a moment with the particular gravity of someone deciding whether to extend trust, and then transferred the bird, which was warm and present, and very still. Constance cupped it and felt the heartbeat against her palms, small and rapid as a wound clock working off its spring, and she breathed slowly and evenly, because she had once been told by a woman who kept birds that they respond to the steadiness of a breath they cannot account for. The bird's feet curled, relaxed. Its eye, bright and very black, opened. She carried it to the terrace door, stepped out into the November air, held it in the cold for the count of 10, felt it gather itself beneath her hands, the way small things gather themselves when they remember they are capable of more than stillness. And then it was gone. A brown streak, purposeful, into the gray London sky above the garden. And she was left standing at the threshold with her hands empty and cold, and the faint, vertiginous sense of having performed something she had not expected to perform today. "You have done that before." She did not startle. She had grown, she realized, accustomed to the particular quality of his arrivals. "My mother kept finches," she said without turning. "You learn the weight of a frightened thing." A silence of the considered variety, the kind that comes before a sentence, not after it. "George has been watching you for the better part of a quarter hour." "I know." She turned. He was closer than she had calculated, 3 feet, perhaps 4, close enough that she could see the gray of his eyes clearly in the outdoor light, which was not flattering to either of them, and therefore honest. He is very practiced at not being seen. He could work on the stillness. Something moved in his face. Not a smile. The territory adjacent to a smile, surveyed carefully, and then decided against, but surveyed. He could, he agreed. And then, after a moment, "He does not approach people easily. He did not approach you the way he approaches people he has decided to observe and then dismiss." She waited, because there was more. And he was a man who arrived at the more by his own route. He was looking at the veil again. Not furtively, with the directness of a man who has decided that looking is less precise than the effort of not looking. "Shall I take it off?" she said. He blinked. She had produced, it seemed, genuine surprise, which she suspected was not a common occurrence. "I beg your pardon?" "You have looked at my veil 4 times today," she said. 5, if I count the church. I cannot tell from your expression whether you find it wanting, or whether there is something on it that interests you. But I have spent a great deal of time this autumn having my veil found wanting, and if there is something actually the matter with it, I would prefer to know plainly. I have no other. The silence that followed had a different quality. Not the silence before a sentence, the silence of someone recalibrating. "Mrs. Vane," he said. Stopped. His jaw moved once, with the controlled deliberateness of a man deciding not how to phrase what he is about to say, but how much of it to deploy. "Tell me, where did you come by the veil?" "It was my mother's." "And your mother's family name?" She looked at him with the level attention of someone who has been asked peculiar questions before, and has learned to decide, before answering, whether the peculiarity is threatening or merely unusual. He met her gaze without adjustment. "Whitmore," she said. "Before her marriage." He said nothing for 3 full seconds, which was long enough for her to understand that the nothing was not blankness. It was a man who has found what he was looking for and is choosing how to proceed. "Has anyone ever turned the border of that veil inside out?" he asked. She had not. It had not occurred to her. One does not investigate grief. One wears it. He offered his hand. Not for the veil. His hand, open and still gloved, for her to take, so that she would be standing with someone when she found out whatever it was he had already found. She took it. The border of the veil, turned back, revealed what the mourning crepe had concealed for 23 years. Stitched in ivory silk thread on ivory ground, invisible unless you were looking, unless you knew the crest and knew what to search for, repeated at intervals of precisely 3 inches around the full circumference. A running hound beneath a bar, and beneath the bar, 2 crossed keys. Constance had seen that crest once, on a folded document she had found with her mother's letters, which she had taken for an old seal of some administrative kind and set aside without examination because there had been so much to set aside in those weeks of sorting. She knew now, with the specific cold certainty of a thing that slots into a space that was always its shape, that it had not been administrative at all. "The Whitmore line," Lord Stanholt said quietly, "carries a baronetcy through the cadet branch. Very old. Dormant by general understanding for the past generation, because the male line failed twice. Yet dormant and extinguished are not the same legal word." She looked at the crest, then at his face. Her voice came out carefully, the way voices do when emotion has been subdued to a single precise question. "You are certain of the crest?" "I am not a herald," he said, "but I know it. One of the Whitmore daughters married a Carew in the previous century. We share, very distantly, an ancestry." He paused, and something in his face briefly allowed the complexity of what this was. "My solicitor can be certain, if you wished him to look." She did not know what to say to him. She was accustomed to not having words in public situations, but this was a different species of wordlessness, not the muteness of someone who has been reduced below the language available to them, but the muteness of someone who has been, in a single moment, expanded beyond the shape she had been learning for 3 years to fit herself into. "Thank you," she said. It was entirely inadequate. She said it anyway, because it was true. He released her hand. She became aware only when he released it that he had been holding it the whole time. It was Lady Sophronia Aldgate who returned the veil to public discourse, because Sophronia had organized 40 years around the certainty that any information capable of reordering a room did not circulate without passing through her. She was positioned near the parlor door when Lord Stanholt escorted Constance back inside, and escorted was the correct word, his hand precisely at the small of her back in the entirely correct manner of a man conducting a woman to a specific destination for a specific purpose. And Sophronia's lorgnette was raised before they had cleared the threshold. "The widow," she said, with the mild observation of someone narrating a painting. And then she said, "Stanholt, what are you about?" "Returning Mrs. Vane from the cold," he said. "She was on the terrace." "She was," said Miss Aurelia Fitch from Sophronia's right shoulder, displaying herself. The room shifted. Not obviously. Quality operates on shifts so delicate that a newcomer cannot see them, but Constance had spent enough time at the margins to read the weather change. Miss Fitch had miscalculated, not in what she had said, which was within the technical bounds of what the season permitted one to say, but in where she had said it, and to whom, and whether the person beside whom Constance now stood was the sort of man who let calibrated cruelties pass without registering them. "Mrs. Vane," he said, with the particular pleasantness that operates as precision, was returning a bird to the air. George was concerned for it. George, who had been standing near the fire with his repaired equanimity and his muddy boot, looked up with the expression of a boy who has been officially invoked, and is uncertain whether this is better or worse than invisibility. "It flew," the boy said to the room at large, "quite fast." Several people smiled. Sophronia did not. Miss Fitch did not. What followed did not resolve itself in a single afternoon. These things seldom do, and Constance had long since stopped expecting them to. Lord Stanholt stood beside her for a precisely calculated 10 minutes, during which he accepted greetings from those who approached, spoke to her twice in low, ordinary tones about nothing consequential, and allowed the room to draw from the tableau whatever conclusions it chose. Then he took his leave, with George at his shoulder, as quietly as he had arrived. He said one thing to her before going, standing close enough that it was between them only. "I will send word." She did not ask him to clarify what he meant. She stood with the words for a moment, then let them sit in the place where she was learning to put things she did not yet want to reason into smallness. The solicitor's letter arrived on the 12th day. It was not a brief document. Constance sat with it at the table in her 2 rented rooms near her cousin's house, a coal fire that required nursing, a window that admitted more wind than light, a landlady downstairs who was not unkind and who had on 2 occasions left extra bread outside the door without making mention of it, and she read it once, and then read it again, and then sat for a long time without reading it a 3rd time, because the 3rd reading would make it fixed. The Whitmore baronetcy itself was not hers to claim. English law in the matter of baronetcies was clear and did not care for the emotions of the women it excluded. What the solicitor confirmed, with the careful balance of professional enthusiasm held against professional caution, was different and more specific. The Whitmore estate in Suffolk, which had passed to a cousin who had since died without heirs, had been settled under an instrument drawn up in 1762 by a man who had believed he would live to revise it, and had not. There was a clause. There is always a clause in estates managed by men who intend to live forever. This clause, in its precise legal language, favored a female descendant of the main line under conditions that applied with precise precision to Constance. She would not be Lady Whitmore. She would be Mrs. Vane, as she had always been, or shortly Mrs. Carew, which was not yet settled, with a small estate in Suffolk and the income it produced. Enough. Enough was a word she had spent 3 years teaching herself not to resent. Lord Stanholt did not write ahead. He came in person 11 days after the solicitor's letter, on a Thursday when the coal fire was making its characteristic insufficient effort, and the London sky had adopted the gray of something that intends to stay indefinitely. She heard the knock and went to the door herself, because there was no one else to go, and he was standing in the narrow corridor with his hat in one hand, and George 6 inches behind him. "I should have sent notice," he said. "You said you would send word." "Word, not notice. I failed to specify the medium." A pause. "May we come in?" George, at his shoulder, was already looking past her at the rooms with the evaluating attention of a child inspecting a space for its essential qualities. "Are you the widow with the veil?" he said. "George." Lord Stanholt's voice was not sharp. It was the voice of a man who has said a name in a particular way enough times that the name itself has become a form of instruction. "Everyone calls her that." "Everyone," said Constance, "may stop." George considered this. Something in his expression suggested he found it reasonable. She made tea with the landlady's kettle, which she had permission to use, and set out the mismatched cups and the biscuits she had bought on a Tuesday with no expectation of guests. They sat in the 2 rooms with the fire at last doing something resembling its purpose, and the gray window behind them, and George ate biscuits with the focused efficiency of a child who has not been offered a tin in longer than he would prefer to acknowledge, and Lord Stanholt sat across from her and looked at his tea, and then at her, with the expression of a man approaching the thing he has come to approach. "The solicitor's letter," she said. "Yes." "I want to understand it." She set her cup down. "Not the legal part. I want to understand why you looked. Why you told me." He was quiet. George became interested in the fire with the sudden intensity that children manage at key moments. "I had seen the Crest before," he said. In my own family documents. I told you. The old Carew and Whitmore connection. When I saw it on the veil, I recognized it. That is the factual answer. He paused. No. That is not the complete answer. She waited. I recognized the crest, he said. And I recognized the manner of a person who has been carrying something very heavy for long enough that the carrying has started to look like ordinary posture. My wife was that way. He said it without evasion, looking at his hands, steadily. She was very sensible about losses, admirably sensible. I admired it for years before I understood that the sensibleness was the shape grief makes when it has nowhere to be set down. The fire settled and resettled itself. George pretended he was made of furniture. She died 3 years ago, Lord Stanholt said. A fever. It was quick. George was 8. I am sorry, Constance said. He looked up. He is improving, he said. She understood from his expression that he meant himself as much as the boy. She poured the second cups. Her hands were steady with the discipline she had constructed over 3 years of pouring tea when her hands wanted to be unsteady. She was grateful for the discipline, yeah. Without it, she would have had to account for the warmth spreading from her sternum outward, which was inconvenient and not yet named. She did not account for the way he watched her pour, the way one memorizes a thing one has decided is worth memorizing. The winter settled in with November's conviction that it would not be rushed. The legal proceedings moved in the slow, procedural way of things that must be unwound by hand, each clause and attestation requiring its week of correspondence and its courier's fee. Constance went to Suffolk in December to see the house. It was smaller than the solicitor had implied, and in better repair than she had feared. And the kitchen garden had gone to seed with the particular determination of a thing that has not given up entirely, only rested. Mrs. Barrow, the housekeeper who had remained through the succession of absent owners, looked at Constance for a long and considered moment when she arrived, taking in her face by sections with the attention of someone whose memory is very long. "You have your grandmother's jaw," Mrs. Barrow said finally. "The one with sense." Constance stayed 3 days and walked the grounds each morning in the cold. She learned the shape of the estate, the way one learns the character of a place one intends to stay in, which walls the wind comes around, which gate requires lifting on the left side, what the kitchen looks like when the morning light comes in from the east. She stood in the small library on the second afternoon and felt, with the specific quality of that feeling, which has no proper name in English, that she was standing in a room that had been waiting for her. She returned to London for Christmas. Lord Stanholt sent a note. George had attempted to climb the apple tree in the Carew townhouse square and had miscalculated the strength of the third branch, which had been forthcoming about its limitations. He wrote it as a sober report. She wrote back that she hoped the coat was salvageable and that December apple trees had the right of it. He replied, on the same day, which was unusually prompt, that George had asked whether she was a widow because she did not have a great deal of money, and that he had explained that was not a question one put to a lady, and that George had said then why could he not ask it if that was what everyone was thinking. She laughed at her table in the 2 rooms with the coal fire, genuinely and without preparation, for the first time in longer than she could account for. January brought his invitation to a dinner at Stanholt House, a small formal gathering, his aunt as chaperone, the guest list built for purpose. She accepted because she had learned, in the past 2 months, to recognize the stages of a patient accumulation, and she wished to be present when the accumulation arrived at its object. Lady Sophronia Aldgate was present. Of course she was. Sophronia had spent 4 decades ensuring that any social occasion capable of producing a decisive moment did not produce it without her observation. She was seated across from Constance at the dinner table, which had not been an accident, and she attended to Constance throughout the meal with the close-focused evaluation of a woman adjusting her estimate of something she had previously undervalued. Lord Stanholt sat at the head. His aunt sat at the foot and managed the conversation with the practiced efficiency of someone who has been managing conversations since before most of the guests were born. The candles were lit, and the wine was poured, and the courses came in their order. And the room had the specific quality of ease that certain well-run houses achieve, where the machinery of hospitality is so well oiled that one forgets it is machinery. Sophronia waited until the second remove. "I am given to understand, Mrs. Vane," she said, with the pleasant directness of a woman who has earned the right to be direct, "that the veil is rather more interesting than it first appeared." "It is the same veil it has always been," Constance said. "The looking has changed, not the veil." A silence. Sophronia considered this with the genuine attention of someone encountering a sentence worth the effort. At the head of the table, Lord Stanholt set his wine glass down without completing the motion toward his lips. "Quite," said Sophronia. The single word contained, for the first time in Constance's experience of it, something other than dismissal. After dinner, the company arranged itself in the drawing room in the natural manner of such evenings, the men having declined to linger over their port by notable brevity. Lord Stanholt came across the room to where Constance stood near the window, not with ceremony, with the directness of a man who has finished computing the distance and decided to cross it. He stood beside her with his back to the room, which was its own statement. "There is something I have been working up to saying," he said. "I know," she said. "I am not," he said, with the careful pacing of a man choosing each word as he sets it down, "a man who finds this sort of thing naturally straightforward. I have been told this, repeatedly, and by people who were correct. You are straightforward about other things," she said. "Things you find worth being straightforward about." A pause. "George liked you immediately. He does not do that. He is particular in the way that makes most people conclude he is difficult, when really he is simply accurate. In that respect, he is more like me than either of us intends. He is a great deal more communicative than you. He is 11. Give it 20 years. The ghost of warmth in his voice arrived and went again. He looked at the dark window, at the January square outside where the gaslight made its inadequate stand against the cold. Constance. Her name in his voice was not like her name in any other voice. She had been bracing for it, she understood now, since the church in November. I am not asking you to be sensible about this," he said. "I am asking only whether there is any reason for hope. If there is not, tell me plainly. I have found I would far rather hear a plain and difficult truth than a kind uncertainty that requires me to keep recalculating." She looked at him in the winter-gray half-light of the window, at the set of his jaw and the quality of stillness he produced, and the controlled precision with which he was holding very still in a way that was not stillness at all, but the visible form of not moving. "There is considerable hope," she said. "I would have told you earlier, if I had been certain you were not simply being properly thorough about the estate." "I was not being thorough about the estate." "No," she said. "I know." His hand at his side moved the small necessary distance to cover hers where it rested on the window frame. Through both their gloves, the deliberate warmth of it, the specific pressure that has calibrated itself exactly so it will be felt. Not a grasp. A placement. The kind of touch that asks nothing and says everything. "I will speak to your cousin," he said. "Tomorrow morning." "He will be very pleased," she said. "He has been very worried about me." "Has he?" "He is a kind man with a kind wife, and they have a comfortable house and 3 children, and they have spent 5 months trying to determine the correct way to tell me that I am going to be all right, while simultaneously fearing I will not be. A silence. And are you going to be all right? She looked at their hands on the windowsill, at the square outside where the January cold pressed its palm against the glass, at the candle on the sill between them, and the way the light caught the edge of his jaw. I think, she said, I'm going to be rather better than all right. They were engaged before February. The notice appeared in the papers on a Tuesday with the correct brevity of such announcements, and Constance's cousin came at once and cried on her shoulder with the relieved vigor of someone releasing 5 months of sustained worry in a single afternoon. George appeared the following morning with the notice clipped from the paper and a series of procedural questions. Would she be bringing Finches? Could he have a dog? Was Suffolk very far from the school he had recently declined? She told him she did not currently have any Finches. He considered this a problem entirely within their combined power to solve. The spring came early. Constance went to the Suffolk house in March to begin the work of making it hers, and Lord Stanholt came to Suffolk in the way of a man whose business happens to require his presence every week or 10 days, at intervals that became, as March moved toward April, less formally spaced and more naturally arrived at. 2 people in the mutual orbit of a place they are both learning to call home. They walked the grounds in the cold, and then in the thaw, and then in the first week of real warmth that arrived in mid-April, with the tentative certainty of things that have waited long enough. He did not take her hand on these walks for the first 3 visits. On the 4th, he did. And neither of them commented on it, because commenting would have been a reduction. She wore the veil once more to a gathering of the county families in March, because it was still within mourning convention, and because she had found she thought of it differently now. It was not the object that had defined her diminishment. It was the object that had contained, stitched invisibly into its border by her grandmother's hands and her mother's hands, what she had always been. She was standing near the window in the county family's drawing room when the vicar's wife said to the woman beside her, in the carrying manner of a woman who has not yet learned to carry less, "Is that Stanholt's widow? The plain one, with the veil?" Lord Stanholt was on the far side of the room. He moved 3 steps and was beside her, with the unhurried precision of a man who does not need velocity to communicate intention. "Mrs. Vane is not a widow for much longer," he said to the vicar's wife, pleasantly, with the mild authority of someone stating a fact that required no defense. "And the veil, as it happens, carries the Whitmore crest, stitched by her grandmother's hand, and her mother's hand after her." The vicar's wife recalculated visibly. Constance watched the recalculation with the specific and curious absence of pain it produced. The clean sensation of a thing that had once been a wound that has closed. They married in April, in the Suffolk church, in a ceremony that was small because they were both past the age that requires an audience to confirm the reality of a thing. George was present, in a coat that had survived its previous adventures. Mrs. Barrow was there in her good dress and watched the proceedings with the steady approval of someone for whom this had always been the correct outcome. Constance's cousin and his wife attended, and the wife wept and apologized and wept regardless. Constance wore the veil. Not from defiance, not to make a point that had already been made, not to stand in the middle of her own vindication and indicate the terms. She wore it because it was her mother's, and her grandmother's before that, and the women who had worked ivory silk into ivory ground in their long, careful evenings had not been stitching a declaration. They had been stitching love forward into the future, in the only form available to them, addressed to hands not yet known. She walked out of the church on Edmund Carew's arm into the April sun, and the veil caught the light, and the crest at the border caught it too. Each small hound and each small crossed key briefly illuminated, and Mrs. Barrow, standing near the gate with the satisfaction of a woman whose long patience has been correctly rewarded, nodded once. That evening, after the small dinner had finished and the guests had gone and the house settled into the particular quiet of a house that has just become something, Edmund brought her to the library. He wished to show her something, he said. A simple enough statement, delivered with the focused purposefulness he applied to most statements. What he showed her was a portrait beside the window. A young woman, painted in the style of the previous century, in ivory silk, with hair dressed in the fashion of 1748. The expression was the thing, not quite composed, not quite unguarded, something precisely between. The expression of someone who has learned to contain herself fully while the world renders its judgments and has decided, in this one painted moment, not to contain herself quite so much. The brass plate below it read the name Eleanor Whitmore Carew, 1748. "She married a Carew," he said. "You told me. I thought you might like to see who she was." Constance looked at the portrait for a long time. The jaw, the hands, the way the woman had arranged herself in the chair with the specific posture of someone carrying something they have decided to carry with dignity. "Yes," she said. "I know exactly who she was." She unpinned the veil from her hair and folded it the way her mother had folded it, and her grandmother before that. The border turned inward, the crest hidden again. Not from shame, but from the particular care one extends to things that have been reliable. She set it on the library table beside the lamp, and Edmund's hand came to rest beside it, and they stood for a moment in the quiet of a room that had just become theirs in the final and certain way. The fire gave off its steady warmth. Outside, the April dark held the sounds of the estate at rest, a horse in the stable, the last of the evening birds somewhere in the grounds, the long specific exhale of a house that has been waiting for the right people and has now, at considerable last, stopped waiting. She had been, for 3 years, a woman being sorted. She had been a veil before she had been a face, a plain thing before she had been a person, a widow with a purse before she had been a Constance, a wrong before she had been a right. She had been sorted to the back rows and the edges and the peripheries of every room, and she had learned to carry each sorting with the posture that looks, from a distance, like composure. The veil was wrong, Sophronia had said, and had been precisely correct, only not in the way she had intended. If Constance's story has moved you, as I hope it has, leave a word in the comments below. The women who stitched love into mourning crepe and hoped someone would one day have the sense to look deserve, I think, to be remembered. Edmund set the veil aside and offered her his arm, and she took it. And they stood together before Eleanor Whitmore Carew's portrait, and the lamp burned steadily between them, unhurried, the way a thing burns when it has been properly tended and has every reason to last.